I don't know the specifics.
Yeah, me neither. So welcome to the 3% podcast, a bi-weekly podcast brought to you by Open Letter and 3%. We do a lot of different things. I don't know, man. I'm used to my 2-month review intro, so I'm just going to biff this one. But I'm Chad Post from Open Letter Books, and I have two special guests this week. The first one, we'll introduce you guys in kind of backwards order. Justin Murphy, you are here. You are the former reporter at the Democrat and Chronicle here in Rochester, and are currently the research and communications coordinator at Our Local History, and the author of Your Children Are Very Greatly in Danger.
That's right.
Kids are not all right.
And the kids are not all right. I'm a long-time listener and first-time participant to this podcast, so thank you for having me.
And a long time subscriber to Open Letter Books.
Very long time. I think I started in the end of 2016.
Oh my God, yeah. So very long.
Yep.
And then our guest of honor this week is Kyle Semmel, who is a good friend, Cardinals lover of St. Louis Cardinals, baseball fan, translator of 13 books from the Danish, including Rock, Paper, Scissors by Naim Ait, which was published by Open Letter, former director of Writers and Books, is the communications manager of the Western New York Land Conservancy, and he's here to talk about his debut novel, which comes out on October 1st, and is called The Book of Losman.
Yes, correct. The Book of Losman.
Which I've been saying Losman in my head every single day.
Because this is a Western New York podcast, and we're all familiar with the Bills quarterback dynasty of J.P. Losman. So tell us about Losman.
I thought Loss, too.
Yeah.
I thought Loss.
You can pronounce it however you wish. In my head, I say Losman because, like I said, before this started, I kind of modeled the name after Willy Loman. Mm-hmm. And, Losman, I don't really care either way. I did have a funny exchange with Del Reed on Twitter. Del Reed, the Buffalo Bills, one of the super fans over there. And I, made the joke that this is not about J.P. Losman. But maybe it should be. I get a lot of Bills Mafia reading this book.
You could have gotten a blurb from him.
I could have, yeah.
That'd be cool. Yeah, that would be great. Not about me. It's just what the blurb says.
This book is not my story.
That would be the best.
It would be. Actually, I should do that.
Yeah. Too bad the first edition's been printed and you got it in your hand.
That doesn't even matter, really.
So, debut novel, man. Congratulations, first of all.
Thank you.
I just want to start with some basic softball things. What is the book about? Do you want to summarize it? Or do you want to summarize it?
I can go either way. I can do my... So, the Book of Losman is about a literary translator in Copenhagen who has Tourette syndrome, who gets involved in a somewhat dubious drug study in order to find a cure for his condition.
So, okay, perfect. That's very succinct. You have nailed the elevator pitch.
I've said it a few times.
That is the shortest description I've ever heard an author give for their own book.
But it's succinct and it's to the point, right?
It's absolutely perfect.
And you didn't give away too much. Because you could have said hijinks ensue, which they do.
Yeah.
Hijinks ensue.
Yeah.
There's a girl.
There's a girl.
That's right.
There's a divorce that's happened. There's a kid.
There's
some sadness. A lot of sadness.
A quirky neighbor who I liked a lot.
Yeah, and an alcoholic dead guy.
Yeah. Alcoholic dead guy. Lots of Carlsberg, which we're all
lots of Carlsberg. We are drinking Carlsberg
behind the scenes. Look at this. I think one of my favorite parts of the book is where he chugs 2 Carlsbergs and then goes for a run. And I'm just like, get the fuck out of here, buddy! Like, what are you, a Superman?
You had a high tolerance for Carlsberg.
Yeah, sure does. So how did you... so one thing I want to preface and put forth right now at the start is, although you have written about having Tourette syndrome and you do mention this in the afterword too, that this is not an autobiographical book by any means. You are a translator, you have the condition, but obviously you are not part of a drug study in which you go back to your earlier memories. But even so, within the character themselves, it is not you.
Yeah.
You cannot see it as you. However, how did your experiences play into your creating this book? How did you come to write this?
Well, one of the things, I have been writing for 30 years, fiction. Since college, I was 19, I was skipping classes to write a really ridiculous book as a 19-year-old. And all throughout the last 30 years, I've been writing, obviously doing other things too, but I kept writing. And over that time, I would always, because I'm a big history fan, I would always have these historical plots that required a ton of research. I wrote a book previous to this, and I had an agent and all that, and I shopped it around, and it got great rejections from all major publishers. But it took 10 years to write.
Yeah.
And it was a retelling of Beowulf.
Right.
and I had to do a lot of research on not just on Beowulf, but also on like fracking because it was involved. Fracking was involved in that. Set in the southern tier of New York, so it's very different from the original, obviously, but it was using that. And I was also at the same time translating a bunch of crime novels from Denmark. Mm-hmm. And so I thought, wouldn't it be cool to kind of write an updated Beowulf, the kind of the original Scandinavian crime novel, you could say,
right.
Mm-hmm.
and set it in the southern tier of New York State, and then put this little fracking plot in there, because at the time it was before the state had banned fracking. So I did all that. It took 10 years to write, and then I got through the whole process of getting an agent, and then the agent started shopping around, and nothing came out of it except for 47 awesome rejections. Actually, 46. One was a dickish
46 good rejections and one bad.
And one bad one. One was just like, I wish. The exact quote is almost to the effect of, I wish he had taken as many risks with his sentences. That was basically it. It's like, okay, whatever. But with this, I said, I sat down, and it was about the time I started this job here in Rochester at Writers and Books. And, I was searching for something to write, fiction-wise, because I needed an outlet away from work. I needed something, when I get up in the morning, I needed something to write. And I had long had this idea about a pill that you could take that would allow you to kind of go back into your childhood memories and explore them. And so I started exploring how I could do this, and what I settled on was like, the things I know in life. Like I know ticking because I've done it all my life, and I know about literary translation because I've done that for, at that point, it was like 10, 15 years. And of course I had lived in Denmark, so it was like these three things kind of came together, and I'm like, what, I don't have to do a lot of research for this.
No.
I can write a story that is fun, that gives me something to do in the morning before I go to this stressful job.
Yeah.
And that's essentially how it started.
Interesting.
I thought that interests me how you said you modeled him a little bit after Willy Loman, because there are moments in like Willy Loman is kind of a famously pathetic and pathetic character, but there are moments in the book where Losman is just pathetic, and he's kind of a farce when he's anal retentive about his number of pages and his social interactions. But I thought it was I appreciated the depth of the way that you then pulled it back, and like the interactions that he has with his son are like, that's not pathetic at all. That's a very strong human being, and the way that you had both of those things in there, I thought made it such like a well-developed character.
Well, that reminds me of the Willy Loman thing though too, is that he's always concerned with getting the insurance money for his kids, and like part of this is like, in a way, like an anti-inheritance, that if this pill can cure Losman, then maybe it could also make sure that his son doesn't go through the same thing he did. Just to throw in there another thing. There's not a question there.
Yeah, no. Yeah.
How did you come to get this book, by the way? I think
you know what,
Kyle was shocked that you had read it.
I don't know. So I pre-ordered it from a local bookstore, and I won't say which one because it was hijinks ensued. But they emailed me, I don't know, 2 months ago or something. We're like, oh, your book came in. So I went and got it, and I hadn't paid any attention to when the release date was, so I just assumed it was out. And it was sitting on my desk, and I was like, after a while, starting to feel bad. I hadn't read it yet. So I read it, and I went to go online to say something, to pump it up, and I was like, oh, shoot, it's not even released yet, like for quite a while, actually. So they blew through the embargo by like a pretty long time.
I don't know if there is any embargoes on
it's
level.
The whole thing is strange, and what I think happened was I got there was a number of people who got the same message. People who ordered the book that I know who wrote me and said, I thought this was coming out October 1st, and So I think what happened is if you order through Bookshop, I think the algorithm says X number of books are ready.
I can
send them
explain
out.
this. I can explain
you go ahead and
this.
explain.
Okay. So for any distribution, they want you to have, you set up pub date as a publisher. Pub date is truly artificial unless it is something that has to be embargoed. Stephen King's new novel or a book about Trump, whatever, like something that would be like have like a relevant moment where they want it to be all released on that day so that you can manipulate the bestseller list, right? Because then the sales for that week are extraordinary. So Oprah Book Club stuff like that. Otherwise, like your distributor has to have the books like 6 to 8 weeks in advance, and they just start shipping them as soon as they're like 6 weeks in advance, as soon as they're there, letting them go out to the stores so the stores have it. So then if it is reviewed on October 1st, someone goes like, oh, I read this review, and they go in and the book's already there, rather than like it ships on October 1st and like the store doesn't have anything. So it needs to be there in advance. So like, is that surprising? I was more surprised that I saw that you got your author copies like yesterday.
Really?
And like that's a little bit more. Like you should have been the first to get your.
That was the first one you held in your hands was yesterday?
The first new. Well, it's actually. I think it was like a week ago.
Oh,
It wasn't. I posted that yesterday. I think.
Oh, you're
but
just
I
manipulating time too.
I would have loaned it to you.
No, that's okay. I know the book pretty well. I don't need it, but I appreciate it. I just I got him yesterday or whatever last week, and that's fine. I wasn't in a rush. I've got plenty to do.
Yeah.
I have a question. So you just discussed the previous book you wrote, and you said you went through 10 years and 17 drafts, and I wonder. And so you were happy with the way it come out. It just didn't get picked up. First of all, what does that look like to do 17 drafts of a book? And how did that feel different from this process, which I take it was not quite as painful?
Yeah, this process wasn't quite as painful, but it still ended up taking nearly as long, but not as many drafts. So in that previous book, for me, a draft would be like, okay, so I finished off say a first draft, and then went through the second time and just like, you know what, this is all wrong, and so I kind of either changed the way it was, narrated out or plotted out, or I got rid of certain scenes, I added other scenes in, and I did that like 17 times essentially. Wow. Because I just, for the longest time, I just wasn't entirely satisfied. It would go in different directions, first person, not second person, first person or third person. Mm-hmm. Like I wasn't sure. At one point I tried to do I tried to write it as if it was in the same meter as Beowulf, which would have been cool, but it also would have been like 800 pages, and so that didn't do so well. But like literally taking the text from the book and putting it in kind of meter, and I'm not a poet and I don't necessarily know meter that well, but I just wanted to look like the meter, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So that's what that process kind of looked like.
So you wanted to have a book that looked like poetry about Beowulf? Like, in other words, like no one would buy it? Like, literally no human being.
Which is ultimately what I settled on. Because, it's what I settled on. Because, this book was already weird, in a sense. Mm-hmm. It was like a crime novel with a horror and suspense mixed in. But it was also, the term literary fiction is a little bit ridiculous in certain ways, but at the same time there's a way to measure that, like the sentences, the characters. I mean, you can see like when something is not necessarily literary, and I tend to think of myself as on the literary side just based on the sentences, because I take good care with them and the dialogue and all that. Others may not agree with that, but the stories themselves tend to be on that literary side, not necessarily about the crime or the suspense. They tend to be, more literary, for lack of a better term.
I just talked through my class about this, but that exact question, I have a totally different response.
That's fine. Say it. I don't care if you, yeah, my take on that is
sentence structure and sentence quality is more or less what you're saying, like the quality of the writing part.
Partly.
I was trying to parse it for them in like different buckets of that. What would be like a traditional, conventional book, fiction, novel right now is the type that does retain reality as its firm point, or like a certain visual reality. Everything's a visual reality. It describes things that you can see, things that you can hear, things that you can touch. It stays within a world that is like concrete and that fits our like accepted perception of whatever's around us. So like we opened up Chris and Hannah's The Women, number one bestseller right now. One sentence, and it's like, there was a parking ticket affixed to the front of the window and his bumper of his car was rusted. And I was like, see, it's like physical descriptions. And that literary is something where the sentences don't have to refer, the book doesn't have to refer to a physical outside reality, but can be something that's either internal or like I picked up in Eric Cheviard's book just randomly to page, and it's a list of, it's 9 points of like why this one guy sucks, and it's just like randomly like off into a Never Never Land of like a philosopher. So it's like divorced from some sort of like it's not immersive. I would say literary is less immersive than.
Can you think of a counterexample of a highly literary book that nonetheless is strictly grounded?
Extremely grounded. I mean, you can go through like Proust. Like there's different versions. There's different ways that you can like. Although Proust is like hardly grounded. I mean, it's also like fantastical in the sense that everything's filtered through his like egotism and like whatnot. So there is like a level of readership that's required. It has to be active too. The reader has to be actively engaged rather than it being like passive entertainment, being conventional, whatever you want to call it, commercial fiction. And literary fiction requires the author or the reader to do something, to be engaged with it. You can't just sit back and be like entertained.
Doesn't that apply to all books though?
I don't think so.
How about an education?
You read some of these other books, man. You look at some of these motherfucking things that are out there, and you're gonna be like, no, you're right.
What about in edge case? Like I'm thinking of Charles Portis, who they're strictly in the world, but they're extremely literary.
Everyone has their different definitions, man. Yeah. Everyone has different definitions. My argument of what we're looking for is more where like the novel, and the other side of that, like a subset of that would be like if a novel becomes art. If the book is elevated to art through its structure is another part of this that we're not talking about. We're talking about sentence level. But structure is a huge part of it too. If the structure is the simple like beginning, middle, climax, end,
sure.
And it is primarily like a realistic writing style, it's probably in my world going to be like, if not, I wouldn't necessarily. I mean, literary is a dumb term. Literary fiction is a dumb term. Yeah. Let's accept that. But within that grouping, would think of that more as being like upmarket fiction, or like one of these other subcategories of like you're not going too far. You're like sticking with it.
That's interesting in my world, or I guess my former world now of journalism, because that's kind of like the easiest way to describe the dividing line is that if you're just a hack writing a story or a story and you're treating it that way, you just kind of go, here's the lead, here's what happened, blah, blah, blah. And the literary form, I mean, you're still in all the facts, but you're rearranging the structure.
Yes.
And maybe you're still grounded in that way, but you are making a choice to zoom in on something, to foreground certain details, things like that.
Yeah, there's a really great craft book called I mean, it's technically a craft book, but Spiral, Meander, Explode by Jane Allison, I believe is the right name. And it details like a number of books, a number of examples of other structures that exist in nature and that can be found in literary writing, like Spiral, like the Tristram Shandy. Like
you wrote about this for your blog years ago. And
I found that anything I talk about, I look up and I've written about it.
Yeah. So going back to structure, I remember reading one of your blog posts, and I think I've mentioned this to you, and that was what led me to think in terms of a circularness to this narrative.
Yes.
Because I like that. I don't know if going back to the literary thing, I think there's a fluidity to it. That,
for sure.
You're. I want to make sure this is clear from my perspective that you're suggesting a much more rigid version of it than I think you actually mean.
Right.
So like right now, the
words
words you're saying here suggest a rigidity that I don't think you actually mean. And I would also argue that there's much more fluidity between what is literary and what is what is not literary. And it's not just the sentences, obviously.
Right.
That's what I pulled out there. But like in structure, obviously has something to do with it.
And I thought your book did like a really great job of, because I agree on the sense level, it's extremely well done. But there's like legitimate fun episodes where people are like creeping around doing weird things and the reader is really engaged in it. So I enjoyed how it had kind of both elements like that.
You leave a lot of like empty spaces too, and this is where the reader our participation happens. Like the memories aren't always fully articulated. There are things that are like on the edges that are never quite defined, and that's part of it too.
Yeah.
Like it's much less likely in like a Dan Brown or and this is the contrast I meant to set up, and I just blanked on the second beat, is the crime novel that Losman is translating is the opposite of what we're talking about as non-literary writing. Like, nothing's left to the imagination. It's all like articulated and explained and has like a that sort of structure to it. I find that if it's not using term literary, non-literary probably is super irrelevant, but interesting to me and not interesting. That sort of thing that you describe in there does not engage me in the least.
No. Yeah, I get that.
However, I love like Tana French books. They're all very concrete in terms of what's going on, but they utilize like various tricks of like point of view and of structure that I find engaging. And
and I will say that that's the one of the in the previous book that we talked about with the 10 years, 17 drafts. I had 4 different narrators in there, and this is obviously one point of view, and it's very concretely. I knew that it would be a much easier book to write if it's just a straight up one person, and so I stuck with that throughout.
And, what was so this is kind of a grounding mechanism. Something that I really picked up on was the tics were not only a part of the story and a part of the character, but there was hardly an instance of him doing anything out in the world where it did not include a mention of his experience with that. And after the 5th time, I was thinking like, okay, I get it. But then after like the 40th, 100th time, whatever, I realized like that's a very effective way of conveying the way that this person moves around in the world.
Yeah.
Because you wouldn't do that if a physical description or like any other thing. It would be too much repetition. But in this case, it's like, no, this is the guy's life. Like, this is how he comes into every single interaction, and so we're coming in there with him. I thought that was really well done.
Thank you.
Yeah, me too. I think that was really interesting. One kind of half thing I was thinking about in terms of the book when I finished it is that there's always like, for most books you have to have a big bad, right? Like, you have to have like the thing you're going to overcome, and in this case the big bad is Tourette's, which is like kind of an interesting like, but then it's not in the end. Like, I'd argue that in the end it's not that, but in some ways it's like that's set up as your big conflict is him versus Tourette's.
And can I say one of the things that in writing this, and when I around the time when I started writing it is when I was officially diagnosed with this. And this is something I've had, this issue all my life and always thinking about it. But when I started writing it, I was I'm losing my train of thought here. Sorry.
That's okay. Think about like I don't know.
Oh, give me a second here. Give me a second to remember what I was trying to say. You guys keep talking because this is an important point. Oh yes, I didn't want to write this is not a story that is like, how do I say this? I'm very respectful of Tourette and everyone who has to deal with it. But at the same time, I have spent nearly my entire life, alone with it.
Yes.
And with the exception of my wife, who who has dealt with it too, and from my dealing with me, and hiding it from others, and I've always had questions about why do I do this? Like nobody, I've never had any answers to that, and so partly why I wrote this novel is to explore the why. And I don't know the answer to it, and that's why there are no answers in this book.
Right.
Because I don't necessarily believe that it's in your memories you're going to find this, and yet maybe, who knows? Is it possible that I had some sort of stressor as a kid that produced these things? Is it possible that I had, self-confidence issues resulting from something that it made me want to tic as a way to relieve whatever stress or pressure? I have no idea. So all of this vacuum that was created in terms of my long-term thinking about what this was is kind of what I was exploring here, and I have no answer for any of this. And I'm certainly I would imagine that a neuroscientist would look at this and say, what is this shit?
Right.
And but this is a novel, and I can explore. I can do whatever I want with it. So that's kind of how I was thinking.
I mean, some of it is like science fiction in that regard.
Yeah, and it's meant to
like
be
hard or not hard science fiction, not extreme science fiction, but like.
I mean, I see it as speculative. I mean,
speculative.
As a speculative fiction.
Like that, this isn't impossible either. And there, it's interesting as you say that. So you wrote 2 articles that had got a lot of attention recently. One, I guess there's 3, but one was about you having Tourette, and that was in Huffington Post, I believe, and talked about like a specific incident in school, which is sort of mirrored in the book. And then there's the one about like translators and writers, which I'd like to talk to you about a little bit later. But the Tourette one. Like, there, aside from Motherless Brooklyn, I don't think I've encountered any artistic work that's really, like, centers that and discusses it. And in some ways, like, this book, not to give away or, like, I don't know that you really can or spoil or whatever, but part of it is, like, an acceptance of that as a reality. So, like, what you're saying about, like, it comes up 100 times or whatever, like, that's just part of it. And, like, he's constantly trying to deny that, fix it, solve it, repair it. That's why I was, like, joking. That's kind of, like, the big bad is, like, that's the thing he has to resolve. And some part of it is like coming to an acceptance. But in terms of like other artistic works, did you have any other reference points for how to, like, growing up, you're saying you're alone. Were there other things, other representations of people with Tourette's and other spaces?
Not really. I mean, there was I did read Motherless Brooklyn, but Motherless Brooklyn is about a different form. Like, you know, we talk about what I forget his name. It's a funny name. Gabriel. What's his name in that book?
Oh, dude,
it's a wacky name, but it doesn't matter. But his Tourette is a version that has, you know, the barking, the shouting, the swearing, which is a very publicly, you know, present version of it. Which, you know, I don't know. I don't have that. Like, I don't have that urge to swear or say anything like that. And so for me, it's always been about more of the subtle kind of things that I think they're subtle. Maybe they're not entirely for others. I don't know. But I didn't have any reference points per se.
Okay.
I think what's there is probably largely caricature. Playing people for chumps and jokes.
Yeah,
and that's what I mean, ignoring. You say that too, like ignoring that, where it's like kind of like for the joke, but like a true representation of like something that does impact a good number of people.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that has resulted from the HuffPost piece is the number of people I got. I don't know how many hundreds of responses from people who have similar experiences as mine, who grew up in an era, you know, I'm almost 50 now, so I grew up in an era before a lot of these questions came about for people who might have a slightly different what's the word here? I don't want to use neurodiversity. Yeah, I'm hesitant to use that, but like different we'll say neurodiverse or differences, whatever you want to say. And so there are a lot of people who have experienced some things growing up that very similar to Losman. And I, you know, this is part of, you know, writing what I know was writing a person who has to deal with this on a daily basis. And so I figured if I could write a person that resembles in some way me, then there might be other people out there who would share this experience or at least understand it. It would feel real. And so no references per se.
Right. Which is really interesting. It makes this like a very powerful and important book for a lot of people, and could really like help a lot of people, I think, in some way too.
Well, you know, maybe I don't know. It's a novel, so I don't know. Like I don't know if what I think about whether novels can actually help people. Maybe they can. I don't know. I certainly love reading novels. I read every day, and I feel as though they make my life richer. But I don't know if I've ever read a novel that has changed my life. If that makes sense.
I don't either, but maybe. But regardless, like there are things that are comforting, and that can like I can envision a lot of younger readers, younger people, like gravitating towards that as like anyone that has had similar experiences sees something of themselves. This means something that it's not, you know, it's got some sort of like representation of like the things that they're going through. It also feels like one of those things that could become a TikTok viral moment of like, here's something to be aware of. You're gonna be a TikTok star.
I don't.
That's what I'm pushing you towards.
I highly doubt that.
I'm hyping your book. I'm your hype man right now.
So I have a question about the other important half of the character, which is working as a translator,
Yes.
and it was he is portrayed, I think, in the book as or he views his job, at least in that present moment, as kind of like an office drudge. Mm-hmm. He has this shitty book he has to translate. He doesn't like. He has to do 10 pages a day, whether he likes it or not. He has to sit there and go clickety-clack and type it out. And I imagine that that's not the way that you look at your own work. So I wonder how you kind of like came to use that, or like decided how to portray that vocation in the novel.
In hindsight, probably he would end up writing more than 10 pages a day if he were a full-time translator.
Yeah.
So that is, I've thought about that. Like the reality is that if he's doing this for a living, 10 pages a day is actually not a lot. So,
but I mean, he doesn't see himself as an artist.
Right.
He sees himself as an office worker,
which is absolutely true. And I think there are times when, I would get assigned a book, or I would sign for a book, and it would be, 4 months you get to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And you do feel a bit like a drudge. It is very much like, and partly, I was always working full time while doing it, and that added to my sense of like, oh my God, I'm just a machine here. So I don't know if I'm answering your question. There's a moment. There's always a moment of drudgery to any sort of translation work, in my experience. And I don't mean to say that translation is not awesome. It is, and I really enjoyed the books I've translated. But when you're in the moment and you're sitting there, you've got a book propped up on your desk and you're typing it up. You're just looking. This is what I do. Is like I would have a book here and I'd be typing. I'd be looking back at the book, and then you go through that 4 times. And at some point, it's like, am I a man or a machine?
Yeah.
And it's a weird feeling that way, because it does feel like, particularly when, for me, I wanted to write my own stuff.
Yeah.
And I didn't want to necessarily be, translating stuff, but that's what I was getting paid.
Yeah.
It's like when you sign a book contract, you do the work.
Yeah. So I was trying to think back of other things I've read where a translator is a character in a novel, and the one that I thought of first was one that you all published, The Translator's Bride.
Oh, right. I was like, what?
And that was very different, because he was kind of like a classic old eccentric shuffling around. I mean, he wasn't a drudge at all. He was just a weirdo who happened to. I don't even remember any scenes of him translating the books. It was more like him fetching stuff out of the pawn shop.
He was always getting in fights with his publisher.
Yeah.
And like that book is great because it has two different, two different tones too.
Yeah.
Where it's like his internal is like very like, fuck you guys, everything sucks, and then external he's like, thank you so much for your gracious wishes for today. Like very very funny. But yeah, you're right. There isn't much there. There's Idra Novi, who is featured in one of the other pieces that you wrote about author-translators. I think she's written about it, but she definitely has presented at conferences I've been at lists of books in which translators are key figures. One of the big ones I can think of is A Heart So White by Javier Marias. There's a translator in there in which they intentionally, they're an interpreter as well though. So they're interpreting between two politicians and intentionally misinterpret something to send off like the rest of the plot. But you're right, it's like, it is interesting how it's treated, I think. I agree with like what you're saying. It does seem more like a drudge aspect to it. I wonder how much of that is, it is drudge work. Like editing's the same way. It's like it's sort of fun at times, but then it's also like I've got to crunch pages. Like this has to get done, and it can take a long time to like. Do I really think this sentence is right, or do I think it needs a different word here? How much is that? How much is that really improving it? Like all those kind of like questions come in. Even though, and then you're like, I just really want to like talk about this instead of. Slogging through it. So there's that element to it for sure. Who's the author that you're basing your character on?
I don't.
Come on, you can tell us. No one's listening. We won't tell anyone.
I don't really. It's just I always imagine like the snootiest literary what's the word? the snootiest type of person who wants to be a literary writer, and that kind of just did that.
Yeah.
Everybody has met one at a party who looks the part. I think of that old Albert Brooks movie often, and I forget the name of it, but there's a guy in it who is, I think he's told by his doctor that he needs to run more, he needs to exercise, and so he buys the most expensive suit, and he gets ready to go out, and he goes for a run. And then of course he doesn't run, but he's got all the suit. He's got the suit, and that's what it sometimes feels like to meet certain people who are like, they're all about the show of being a writer and not about the actually doing it. And so I kind of imagined who that would be. The man bun and everything. It's like he thinks he's sexy, and I guess he is, but he's not necessarily a great writer,
right?
And yet he's selling books.
And it's interesting with his. So the just in case we didn't make this explicit, there's a Danish writer that Losman is translating into English. He's written like a very successful book that I forget the title of it now. What's the title of it?
I am going to kill you.
I'm going to kill you, and he's got a sequel to it as well, which Losman also hates. He hates this book. He thinks it's stupid. And there's two things with this. One is that book sounds an awful lot like a Philip K. Dick book, specifically A Scanner Darkly, in which like the character is bifurcated, thinks that he's being tracked by someone, but it turns out to be himself, which is part of that book. But also what was the thing I was going to say? The other thing I was going to say, it doesn't matter. But I thought it's interesting because Philip K. Dick pops up a few times in your book. Is that a specific?
Not really,
okay.
But Philip, I've read him and I like him, and I can't specifically say that influenced this, but at the same time I do appreciate his storytelling.
Yeah, absolutely.
I have another question about translating. I remember at an open letter event, I guess it was probably 5 years ago, when Dubravka Gresham was here. She said something. She had done a little translating. She's a writer, but she had done a little translating, and she said she doesn't like to do it because she finds that to do a good job, it takes her as long to translate somebody else's book as it does to write her own. That sounds like not your experience.
No. Because I would have a contract and I would have to do it, and I would have to do it quickly. So like in every contract I got, it would specify when the book had to be delivered. And sometimes that was as early as 4 months, other times it was 6 months, sometimes it was over a year, which was ideal in a way, but it also was weird in a way. And in the end, I decided, and I felt as though the best ones were the ones were like 6 to 8 months, because you can do, I think, better work over that stretch of time. But in the end, it takes 6 to 8 months to do a translation, and this book, even this book, which is only 200 pages, in the end took about 6 years, and that doesn't account for the 2 years that involve like editorial things and those kind of changes, but it definitely took more time to do this book than any of the translations.
The other thing I was going to say, so except from in relation to that translation too, and they were saying it's a drudge, one of the things that Losman has to do is provide the author with sample pages, which causes him an undue amount of anxiety. And that also feels like very much like a translator situation. Then where one thing that you just said, that you have deadlines and you meet them, is that that's funny. Like I'm not aware of many translators.
I've always met them because
everyone listening.
I've always met them because I'm always super I'm on time to things. I have this anal retentive.
It's wonderful. It's amazing.
Yeah.
It's unusual. It's rare, but his anxiety about sharing his work, sharing this translation with
and that's based on composite experiences from other translators who have had those moments where it's like they're still working on the book and the people want to see pages, and it is really, it puts you in an awkward position, I think, because a translation, like any piece of art, requires time, and it requires a lot of thought and revision, frankly.
A lot of revision.
And I'm definitely the type of person who, when it comes to translations, I would always try to get the full thing done one pass. Marion Schwartz taught me this.
Yeah.
Marion Schwartz is a Russian translator, wonderful person. I interviewed her years ago, and I'd never forget what she said. She does 4 passes through a manuscript. And, the first is basically just barfing it down on the page. Doesn't matter about syntax, grammar. There's even words that she doesn't know, that she'll just leave them in there. And then gradually through each pass, it gets clearer, cleaner, and better. And I took that to heart, and I started doing that. But for me, it ended up being 5 or 6 passes.
Yeah.
Because maybe it's because I wasn't as efficient, but I would always, maybe it's because I'm super anal, I don't know. But I would go through it again and again and again. And I just, but it does require a great deal of effort through each different pass, and different things happen in each pass. And I do really appreciate that about translation. One of the things that, like with any writing, and you know this from your own work, when you nail something, when you get a sentence that is really good, it's exciting. Not to be nerdy here, but it is. It's a really fun feeling. And when you have a piece that you feel from top to bottom or from start to end is it aligns, or it does something that has some sort of magic in it, whether it's a 200-word piece or a 2,000-word piece or whatever, there's some magical beauty in that is addictive. And the same is true with translation. Getting those words right, it takes a long time, but it's addicting.
Richard, do you want to read a bit so that people can hear?
Sure. I thought I would read from the beginning, just to give a sense. I don't know if I like it when a writer starts outside of the beginning, because it feels weird.
Okay.
You're not going to read from the scene where the neighbor walks into his apartment?
You mean later on?
Yeah. No, you do what you want.
Yeah. I'm going to leave that one off for now. I want that to be a bit of an element of surprise.
Holy shit.
She walks in and everything's fine. Nothing happened.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of erections in this book. Just so happy.
Yeah, I do know that, yeah. Well, I'm writing what I know, right?
you know of erections? It's a bold statement for a 50-year-old man, bro.
Yeah.
Go with your
Damn. All right. So this is the beginning of the book. The first, depending on how long this takes, it's the first 2 pages. When he moved to Copenhagen with his Danish girlfriend, Kat, 15 years ago, Losman imagined his life like a folder's guidebook, rich with possibility and adventure. But it didn't turn out that way, because no life ever did. And now that Kat had left him, he lived alone, except on the weekends his son, Axel, visited. Losman was a literary translator. On an average day, he woke up, made coffee, and got to work filling Word documents with letters. 10 pages a day, that was his goal. On this particular day, he would discover a dead man, punch a swan to save a little girl, and find an experimental memory study that would alter his life and possibly his brain chemistry forever. Not an average day at all. But at this moment, all that was in the near future. Now, in the present, he sat at his desk, gaping at his fuzzy computer screen, having made it through 6 tedious pages of translation, when he was startled by a knock at his door. It was a soft, hesitant rap, as if whoever was knocking was sorry to interrupt. Losman wasn't sure what he'd heard was real or imagined, but it left him momentarily breathless with anticipation. A visitor? Did he have a visitor? He cocked his ear to listen, and he heard it again, louder, definitely a knock. "Et Oerblick," he said, standing abruptly. He rummaged the floor for his pants and slid them on as he stumbled across the room. When he opened the door, he found his upstairs neighbor, Caroline Jensen, standing on the landing, dressed in a green gabardine coat and cloche hat. "Yes?" he said. "Herr Kramer fell," she said, pointing a slender finger up the stairwell. 2 flights above lived a crotchety old man named Kramer, an overweight, alcoholic former postman Losman didn't care for. Losman stared at Caroline's jet black fingernails. "How do you know he fell?" he said. "I heard a loud thud last night when I was making coffee." "Last night?" Losman said. "Can you help?" He glanced at his laptop behind him. He still had 4 pages to translate, and he didn't like to step away from his day's work prematurely. The anxiety it caused him would swell like a tumor and increase his tics. But he knew that he couldn't say no, not to Caroline Jensen. He followed her up the stairs like an obedient puppy. Nervous and anxious, his Tourette besting him like the lord and master it was, he squelched an urge to jerk his head and blow out a noisy puff of air. When they reached Kramer's door, she raised her hand and knocked. "Herr Kramer," she said, "Herr Kramer, won't you open up?" There was no answer. "I assume you don't have a key," Losman said. She shook her head. "Maybe he's not home?" "He's home." Caroline nodded at the long rectangular mail slot that was a staple in old apartment buildings like this. "See for yourself." Losman squatted. He took a deep breath, pushed his index finger through the slot, and lifted the lid. A decadent odor, pungent of cigarettes and feces, stung his mouth and eyes. He flinched, pulling his hand away from the slot and gasping for air. "Did you see him?" "Not yet," he coughed. After covering his mouth and nose with his left bicep, he lifted the lid one more time. Holding his breath, he now saw a mountain of letters and magazines and newspapers piled on the floor. Losman scanned the room. What he was looking at was an apartment that was the perfect replica of his own, only in reverse. There was a recliner, a sofa, and a coffee table. At the far end, straight ahead, a wall yellowed by cigarette smoke divided the living room from the galley kitchen behind it. And there Losman saw a pair of unmoving legs sprawled out on the floor in the hallway, surrounded by broken glass. The other half of Kramer's body was lying on the kitchen linoleum, out of sight. Losman got to his feet. "You better call somebody," he said to Caroline, wanting desperately to shake his head or clear his throat or blink or snort. "I think Kramer is dead."
So two things I want to ask. Well, good job, first of all. Congratulations. First up for applause. Everyone listening, you applaud right now wherever you are, no matter how you're listening to this. So we can talk about the fact that part of that scene is inspired by one of the books that we translated.
Yeah.
So like the crossover between what you translate and what you write is like, that's a nexus point, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the other thing that I noticed throughout this that I thought was interesting is that you do incorporate Danish a lot. And like without noting it. Like it's just there as a texture of the book. This is maybe the only sentence that's italicized in Danish. Otherwise the Danish is just in Roman script. There's no way of like denoting that it's like a foreign language. I think that's a really good and interesting move that's much more you see more often with like Romance languages of the sort of like French, Spanish, words that like people are like, quasi familiar with. And for Danish it's, much less likely that someone's going to be familiar with those particular words. But the fact that it is just part of their lives and you don't draw attention to it, I think is a very smart move from like a craft perspective and like political perspective. Was that like an intentional choice?
It was very intentional, yeah. I mean, this to me it goes back to, I've had a writing teacher once who said, if you are visiting a hospital room and somebody is dying, you need to describe that hospital room. And you need to be able to see this person dying. You're not in an empty space, Yeah. And that's kind of has followed me throughout all my writing is I try to describe the things. And to me, the thing that, this is somewhat interior, this book. He lives alone. There aren't many characters. And so the interior or the Danish language, the culture he's in, those are part of the room that he's in, so to speak. So that I felt like it has to be in there.
Yeah.
The verisimilitude of living in Copenhagen.
Right.
For the people who don't live in Copenhagen.
Right.
So a person who just only hears that, when you get to that point, you might be led to think that there's some kind of murder mystery element to it. In the Kramer, he does carry through in the book, but not in an active way, in part because he is in fact dead. How did you decide on this opening scene, and was this from the get-go? Was this the opening scene?
Yeah, and so this is where it aligns with what Chad's other part of that question was. I translate a writer whose work I absolutely love. His name is Simon Fruland. And one of my first translations was a book of short stories, small book, like 120 pages, called Milk. And one of the stories in that book is called Kramer, and it's about this guy and what he does on the stairwell with
jerking off.
With
Mm-hmm.
that's a spoiler.
Call it what it is. It's the next sentence.
What he does on the stairwell is what he does in the original, in the Danish, in the story by Simon. And I have always found that scene to be fantastic, but also a little bit, it's kind of gross, and yet it's vividly there, And to answer your question, I don't know. I don't remember anymore if this was the first scene always. I think it was, though, because I did know that I wanted Kramer involved. I didn't realize just how much Simon's work would kind of infiltrate this book, though, because in addition to Kramer, there are other scenes in which there's a cross-dressing scene, sort of, with I shouldn't say scene, but like Caroline herself wears outlandish clothes and does things, and that's kind of taken a little bit from another story in that book, and then even the fact that Losman is a translator who's being hounded by a writer who wants his pages is kind of taken from the world of Varvra, where in Simon's book he's writing a book. He has to write it in 8.5 weeks about this 80-year-old woman, eccentric woman, and his publisher is kind of on his neck about getting those pages to him. And when I started writing this, I definitely wanted Kramer in there. I didn't realize, again, just how much Simon's work had kind of really grown into me.
Yeah.
And it's sort of an homage to him. And he totally gave me license to do it. In fact, he read this book, gave me feedback. And he gave me license to do this, and I just really enjoy that kind of meta quality to this.
Mm-hmm.
That Losman is translating a book within the book, but that also the some of the scenes, some of the stuff that are in the book are stuff that I've translated.
Yeah.
And that's, to some extent, that's my amusement. Like, you could read this and have no idea that this is true. It's just purely my amusement.
Another question? I think we should probably start wrapping up.
Probably getting there, yeah.
Probably around over an hour now, but I really like the book. I really appreciate you both coming here to talk about it and having such good kind of insights. Everyone should go buy the book. The last thing I was going to add, I have one last question, but last serious one I have to ask is, do you want to say a word about your publisher?
Yeah, absolutely. So SFWP is it's called the Santa Fe Writers Project, short SFWP. They have been around for 25 years. They actually did publish the previous book I mentioned, Milk, and other stories, Simon's book. And I think that's partly why maybe this was so enticing to them too, because here I come with a book that is using that other book as kind of a launching point. Mm-hmm. But they have done fantastic work, not just with me, but also with all the other authors they have. And one of the things that I really appreciate is that they work with a subrights agent. And Chad and I have talked a little bit about this, but they have an agent who essentially can help market the books or shop the books to Hollywood, to translation rights, for audio rights, stuff that a lot of small presses don't do.
Yeah, it'd be great to have someone who was a rights person that did all rights for any of these.
It's kind of like it's a small press, but with a big press. What's the word I'm looking for? I mean, big presses will have that person, and so it's somewhat merged between the two, and I really appreciate that. And this book has sold audio rights thanks to Susan Schulman is her name, the Susan Schulman Literary Agency, and that was huge, and it was one of the things that really enticed me about publishing with SFWP, because they just do such. Their books are really good. and they treat their authors right. When I first signed the contract, they sent me, the publisher Andrew Gifford sent me a marketing timeline, and basically said, here's what you need to do.
Thank you for that.
Okay, here's what you need to do over the next 2 years.
Yeah.
And it was really helpful, extremely helpful. And I don't know if other small presses do that, but Andrew does at SLWP, and it was immensely important for me.
So, as a final question, we are recording this on, whatever today is, Thursday, September 12th. You're listening to it anytime after Tuesday, the 18th or whatever it is. Tonight, we're all in Western New York. The Bills are playing Miami. This is a big NFL game. Final score prediction, Justin, go.
30-10 Bills.
All right, so I'm a Bills fan, okay? But I think, and I told my son this, that I think the Dolphins will win 38-31 tonight. The reason being, I want to be able to see that the Bills secondary can stop the Dolphins, and I'm not yet convinced. If they can do it, I will. I hope I'm wrong. I hope they can stop them, but I'm not convinced they'll be able to stop them.
I'm going Dolphins 45-35. So 2 Dolphins, 1 Bills. You
come on.
If I can tell you guys, because of my curse, and people listening probably do know the curse. If I go watch this in a bar, the Bills will lose. So I can control that. World Series champion.
You know what? I'm a Twins fan, and they're slumping, but that just sets them up for a good redemption arc.
As long as they don't play the Yankees.
As long as they don't play the Yankees. No, they beat the Yankees last year. Don't worry about it.
Yeah.
Well,
I know it won't be the Cardinals.
No.
No.
Anyone else you want to bet?
I would say I'm pulling for the Padres.
I was thinking the Padres, and now that you said that, I'll switch to the Orioles.
Okay.
Just so we have 3 different answers.
All right.
But yeah.
I would take either the Padres or Orioles, frankly.
Yeah.
I would take the Twins too. The Twins are my American League team.
Yeah, I like them, and I like the Orioles a lot too. But I think it could be the Dodgers here.
Dodgers look good.
That Shohei Ohtani knows to hit a ball.
He's going to be the first 50-50 guy.
I know. And not MVP, according to lots of people.
Wow.
Anyways, thanks for listening. We'll cut you off from all the sports talk radio aspect of this, but as always, you can find us wherever you find us, on Twitter, on Instagram.
We should say that if you can pick up Losman, by the way, the Book of Losman, you can order it at any independent bookstore. You can order it anywhere books are sold.
And some of them will ship it to you early.
Yep. There'll be a link in the show notes to the bookshop.org where you can purchase it. But yeah, go to your local bookstore, get that. Like, favorite, subscribe, tell your friends, tell your parents, tell whomever, and we'll be back in a couple weeks with a new episode.